They say you're a man of vision.
Hell of a vision.
My favorite ending to any Western, if not one of my favorite endings in general, is the ending of the Lonesome Dove miniseries. I feel that Call's quote about having a hell of a vision, which basically results in death and failure, perfectly highlights the sacrifice and smallness of life on the frontier. And in this case, it's specifically about the American westward frontier, but I think this idea applies to any frontier and any place and in any time. Because of this ending and its portrayal of the sacrifice and cost of such expansion through Western life, I think that Lonesome Dove is the most human Western that we have. And I also think that Lonesome Dove does the best job of capturing what it is, which makes frontier literature the most existential of all literature. Oftentimes, when it comes to Westerns, we have a mix of opportunity and hope portrayed with themes of failure and destruction. That's certainly present in Lonesome Dove, but more recently, I feel like the Western has been used not as a vessel for communicating storytelling about hope, but really instead for one about loss. Specifically, Blood Meridian is sort of the ultimate apocalyptic Western, if not basically post-apocalyptic. On the wild frontier, especially one which so focuses on violence and debauchery like Blood Meridian, there is no society, there is no law, and if there is a law, it is fragile and weak. There are no rules, the morality is what you make, and so if the people who hold power are bad people, well, everyone is going to be bad. This is common in Western literature with outlaws and villains and such, but it's also really common to dystopian or post-apocalyptic literature.
World needs bad men. We keep the other bad men from the door.
The Western frontier as a setting, especially in Blood Meridian, is really interesting to me because it's one of the only settings which I feel like can kind of perform the horseshoe of both portraying the beginning of humanity and the end of humanity. Blood Meridian explores the banality of evil and sort of senseless violence post-societal collapse, but puts it in a setting and a context which is actually about the developing of civilization, specifically American civilization through Manifest Destiny. Another novel which captures this vibe and atmosphere really well is The Gunslinger by Stephen King, which is set after an apocalypse in a fictional world, but uses basic American Western iconography to tell its story of the apocalypse. And specifically, it's important to note that both of these works, Blood Meridian, The Gunslinger, and, things including Lonesome Dove, are told from an American perspective, which is usually about growth and conquering, which is certainly not apocalyptic for the Americans, but would be very apocalyptic for the Native Americans, or anyone else who is living on a frontier which is currently being conquered. However, the Western portrayal of the frontier with all of its violence and destruction and man-on-man conflict is not the only way that this existential experience can be explored. For example, just basic immigrant literature, I feel, also covers the same thing, in that we have characters and people who are looking for a new place or a new life or a way to sort of start over or begin even for the first time. Specifically, we have immigrant frontier literature, which does a lot of times overlap with American, just basic Western frontier literature, but it's not quite the same. For example, in the novel Giants in the Earth, we are not in the West, but we are basically like in the Midwest, in the Dakotas and around Minnesota, which has a very different feel to it. Unlike the traditional Western, the biggest villain here is not other people, it's not the apocalypse, it's just sort of the basic setting, and mankind's efforts to conquer the land and the elements which exist in that land. And frontier literature, specifically something like Giants in the Earth, is really great at capturing the smallness of mankind sort of at its dawn. Giants in the Earth frames this as an existential struggle, or basically as a retelling of mankind's beginning, even through its subtitles. For example, Book 1 is called The Land Taking, and Book 2 is called Founding the Kingdom. And not only through these titles, but through the basic language in the text, the author, Rovag, is trying to make mankind feel very small and insignificant in the face of this vast plane of existence. At the moment when the sun closed his eye, the vastness of the plain seemed to rise up on every hand, and suddenly the landscape had grown desolate, filling it with terror. Behind them, along the way they had come, the plain lay dark green and lifeless, under the gathering shadow of the dim, purple sky. I love this section because it highlights the smallness of the struggle that the main characters are going through. Nature and the world and just existence in general, the frontier, does not care about your goals or your aspirations or how moral your purpose is or if it's ordained by God or not ordained by God. Similar to the justice we see in Blood Meridian, there is no justice. Things simply happen because they happen, and mankind is extremely small in the face of nature. This is highlighted by the end of the novel when our main character, Perhanza, is not killed by a man, as he probably would be in something like Lonesome Dove, but instead by nature. He's caught in a snowstorm, and he freezes to death. Despite all of his years of effort, the time he spends getting up early to work on his house, the morals he tries to instill in his children, this man, in his search for meaning, finds it by freezing to death. And where Giants in the Earth sort of portrays the prairie as this Garden of Eden, which is experiencing humanity for the first time, My Antonia, by Willa Cather, shows a different angle in that the main character is not the man going to a place to begin his life, but the child being brought into a place. My Antonia sheds a light on growing up with the world rather than growing up in the world or trying to make the world grow up. And My Antonia very much fits in with the old kind of classic poetry technique of pastoral elegy, where characters reject the hustle and bustle of modern life and return to and yearn for a calm, quiet, basic upbringing or lifestyle in nature, the sort of agrarian setting that the founding fathers of the United States really cared about, which we see reflected in frontier literature as a return to one's roots in the great wild plain, where they can test their chances and develop their sense of morality along with the development of the actual world. There's actually a series of paintings which I think demonstrates what I'm trying to say really well, which is The Course of Empire by the artist Thomas Cole, which basically looks at the same plot of land across a long period of time, from it being non-developed to an agrarian society to a thriving civilization to the fall and destruction of that civilization and the time period after that civilization. Through his use of nature, Thomas Cole is doing a great job of portraying once more the smallness of not just humanity and man, but also man's achievements. It does not matter how tall he builds his towers, or how deep his thought, or how great his ideas, if he cannot preserve the sanctity of those towers, those achievements, and those ideas. This painting series is also widely considered to be a criticism of Jacksonian politics in the Americas during the 1800s, and Jackson was a massive proponent of manifest destiny and westward expansion. And in this sense, I think that the Course of Empire and Lonesome Dove are both raising interesting questions about the potential of the West and the openness of the frontier, not only representing mankind's opportunity to thrive, but also mankind's opportunity to fail and be small, as Perhanza does in Giants of the Earth. And the way mankind fails really varies from text to text. In something like Lonesome Dove, he fails because of his hubris. In Blood Meridian, he fails because of his lack of morality. And in Giants of the Earth, he fails simply because of nature. In My Antonia, however, we don't necessarily have mankind failing, we simply have mankind growing up and industrializing, and that our main character is telling our entire story by reflecting upon his childhood. And in so doing, he is tapping into that basic pastoral elegy of wanting return to the place where he was and where he grew up, which is the old world. In other words, going to a new land sort of invites this idea of opportunity or return to an Edenic slate, to cleanse yourself of original sin and start over. But in almost all frontier literature, the characters fail to start over in the proper moral way and instead are punished due to the immorality of their actions, either because of their bad treatment of the land or because of their poor treatment of the inhabitants already living on said land. As mentioned, we see this a lot in dystopian stories as well. For example, in something like The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins or Anthem by Ayn Rand, as well as a variety of other texts, characters sort of reject the overwhelming, busy, morally corrupt state of the world. They leave their large cities, their large societies, and instead return to nature and return to a sense of center, of moral center, so they can begin not only their own lives, but also restart society in a way that they see to be more fit and moral. But this doesn't just end with the prairie or with the West. As Star Trek famously opined,
space, the final frontier.
And space is interesting, I think, in the context of immigrant or frontier literature, because it gives us a wholly new frontier to conquer theoretically with more ethics and understanding than we conquered our pre-existing American frontier. Space allows humanity to explore beyond its origins rather than just explore back to its origins. And there are a lot of great science fiction texts about this, such as Interstellar, Annihilation, Prometheus, and the Martian Chronicles. Prometheus especially is one of my favorites about this theme because Prometheus really digs into what the origin of mankind is and posits that maybe mankind did not begin on Earth, but actually somewhere out in space, raising the case that space is not the final frontier, but actually the original frontier, and suggests that if we really want to find the meaning of ourselves, we're not going to find it on the prairies or on the plains or in the West. We're going to find it in space by going back to where we came from.
We used to look up in the sky and wonder at our place in the stars. Now we just look down and worry about our place in the dirt.
This is basically the same premise and argument the frontier literature makes, in that we'll find ourselves among the giants in the earth, but Prometheus instead puts those giants in the sky. And the Martian Chronicles and Interstellar do the same thing, but basically suggest that in our huge search for meaning and purpose, we are missing meaning and purpose by ignoring the fact that it is in here.
Make him stay, Merv. Don't let me leave, Merv.
Interstellar, of course, famously was derided when it was released because its moral is that love conquers all, and that love transcends space and cosmos and time. And I think that's a really sweet idea, and I don't really buy into the criticism of that at all, because that's sort of a basic tenet of science fiction and even frontier literature, is in this search for meaning, are we ever going to find ourselves? In Interstellar, once the frontier of space has functionally been given up on by the beginning of the film, we have no choice but to return to those plains and that frontier. But in Interstellar, unlike in most other immigrant and frontier literature, there's not a purpose or a meaning in that dirt. It is simply dirt. And there are no giants in that dirt for us to lay among. And for the Martian Chronicles specifically, Bradbury is really interested in existential failure, loneliness, and dread. And while we have this great capacity as humans to build this wonderful technology and to colonize Mars, in a story like The Silent Towns, we see that there is really no purpose in that if we lose our humanity. The two main characters, Walter Grip and Genevieve, are left behind in a Martian settlement after everyone has returned to Earth because of a devastating implied nuclear war. Walter Grip and Genevieve sort of embody this new version of Adam and Eve, where they have a chance to start over and begin their lives as they always wanted. Unlike characters in most frontier literature, they do not have to work for a new frontier. It's literally given to them. And instead of making it work, instead of having a happy life together, Walter and Genevieve don't get along. They hate each other. And they go to their own separate ways of Mars, specifically Walter, because he's not interested in being the Adam to her Eve. They have gone too far with this knowledge and are left with nothing. Bradbury, like Interstellar, is making the case through the Silent Towns at the end of the Martian Chronicles that without love, without purpose, there is no point to the frontier. There is no point to all of mankind's greatest achievements. There is no point to man's frontier. Man's achievements are nothing without love. This is extremely similar to what we see in the arc from the Thomas Cole series, where Mars is initially an uncolonized area, then it goes to this flourishing civilization, and by the end, it returns to nothing because there are no people there to maintain this paradise. Another piece of text that I think actually wraps up all these ideas in a really succinct way is not a book or a movie or a comic, but actually a song performed by the Highwaymen, specifically through their song Highwayman. Highwayman links all of these ideas perfectly. The song begins, the first verse of the song is about a man who is, well, a highwayman. He robs people on the frontier. Again, he rejects these ideas of kind of modernity and of rules and of social standing and just does what he needs to do in order to get ahead. But eventually, because of his hubris and his lack of morality, he is caught, he is hung, and he is killed. But from there, he comes back as a man who works on a ship. He's a sailor. And after that, he's reincarnated as somebody who builds a dam, as we are now kind of at the height of civilization and development. And after that, he's reincarnated as a man who flies into space, as an astronaut. And then finally, after he has been killed in space, he's reincarnated as a single drop of rain. The Highwayman perfectly encapsulates the story of the frontier, in that in our pursuit for knowledge and industrialization and society and civilization, eventually mankind is returned to nothing, a raindrop.
Hell of a vision.
Mankind is small in the scheme of nature, the frontier, and the cosmos. Unless we maintain our love, our morality, and provide a civilization for our next generations to inherit, there will not be a next generation. And rather than conquering the frontier will conquer us. One last example, which I feel covers the same ground as The Highwaymen and all these other ideas, is one of my favorite films, 2017's A Ghost Story. Now, beyond just being kind of like a touching romance and also a good story about a man who really loves his home and misses his life, A Ghost Story is an existential tale about mankind from beginning to end through the point of view of one man. In particular, there is the time sequence where our main character goes back to the frontier, to the place where his house was built, and sees a frontier family killed by Native Americans. After that, he sees his home torn down and a rising metropolis put in its place. And yet through all of this, he exists not as a man, but as a ghost, haunting the story of mankind. And by the end, when he's able to return to his home, and he finally gets to the note that his girlfriend left him after he died, he disappears. The film doesn't tell us what this note says. It doesn't explore this relationship more in depth. It is up to us to decide what has been written on that paper. What is it that finally allows this man to let go of the frontier that is his life? And I have to admit that even though I've seen the film several times over the years and thought about it a lot, I still don't know exactly what it is that's on the note. But I like to think that it's something as simple as,
I love you.
The entire course of the ghost story sees our protagonist feeling left behind, discarded, and small in the face of his life and in the face of the frontier. Just as Woodrow F. Call feels small in the wake of his vision by the end of Lonesome Dove, just as the highwayman becomes small when he becomes a single drop of rain, and just as Perhanza is turned small when he dies in the snowstorm. The only thing which makes these characters large, which can give them meaning in the face of such a vast and unforgiving frontier, and which is so absent in a work like Blood Meridian, is love. That is what I think makes frontier literature the most existential literature. More than any other genre, the frontier genre, the Western genre, allows characters to question what it is that not only makes them human, but which makes humans human. And that is why I feel frontier literature lends itself to blending with almost every other genre. This is why Westerns will frequently have romance. This is why Westerns blend so well with horror. This is also why most of the themes present in Westerns and immigrant literature are seen in science fiction, specifically in the conquering of space. But when you begin to ask questions about time, and when works like Prometheus question the actual origins of mankind,
And beneath that darkness, there's another kind. It was deeper.
you will realize that the frontier is not simply something with a beginning and a middle and end. We do not begin on the plains and end in space.
I could feel, man.
Rather, the frontier, like time, is a circle.
I knew my daughter waited for me there. So clear.
And the frontier, like time, is meaningless without and defeated by.
I love you forever. You hear me? I love you forever. And I'm coming back.